In this short video, I want to return and revisit Acemoglu's thesis. In the last video, I had left you with a brief analysis of Acemoglu's model, along with an explanation of his econometric technique. To revise, Acemoglu's model is a model of economic development that postulates institutions, colonial institutions in particular, as the fundamental cause of economic divergence between countries. Now, the problem with proving such an argument, econometrically that is the endogeneity problem, which, as I argued in the previous video, econometrics try to solve, amongst other strategies, using the instrumental variable technique. The IV technique involves finding a third variable, let's call it Z, that is indirectly linked to our outcome variable via the intermediation of our X variable. In Acemoglu's paper, settler mortality will be that instrumental variable. He's going to argue that settler mortality determined the course of early institutions, which in turn determined whether a colony was going to become a new Europe or an extractive state. But what if the data set that was used by Acemoglu to construct their regression didn't come from settlers, but rather from soldiers? Would our story change? Would the explanation be dramatically different from the one offered by Acemoglu? This is the theme that I want to turn to now. And I want to start with the work of one particular empirical investigator, David Albuy. Albuy was interested in exploring the original data set. In particular, he was curious whether the data that was used by Acemoglu did indeed come from settler mortality and not soldier mortality. So he revisits the original archives, and here's what he discovers. He argues that there are several reasons to doubt the reliability and comparability of the data. Firstly, out of the 64 countries in the sample, only 28 have settler mortality rates that originate from within their own borders. The other 36 countries in the sample are assigned rates based on conjectures, according to Albuy, and these assignments radically reduce the significance of the results. Second, Albuy argues, the mortality rates do not come from European settlers. Instead, a large number of data points originate from soldiers. In other words, implicitly, Albuy's critique points to the reasoning that the instrumental variable used by Acemoglu instruments for conflict rather than early institutions. In other words, with Albuy's critique, we are back in the world of dependency theory. Walter Rodney, who was one of the first scholars to examine the emergence of colonial institutions in Africa, had made a very similar argument 3 decades ago. Rodney's argument was that it was not the extractive state per se, but rather the verb extraction that resulted in the underdevelopment of Africa. Another way of reconceptualizing this, using Amartya Sen, would be to argue that colonial entitlements vary from country to country. In countries where Europeans could create new European institutions, they created a very different entitlement regime than the one they created in extractive states. And this is why new lines of research are beginning to focus on the relationships that existed between the colonizers and the colonized. For today's class, I want you guys to listen to this short interview by a researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, Mallory Avery, who's working on this precise question. Let's listen to her argument and try to compare and contrast it with Acemoglu's thesis. In the discussion forum, I want you guys to answer the following question. How does Avery's argument differ from Acemoglu's argument? Does the argument make sense? How would you combine what you've learned in Acemoglu's paper with what Avery is arguing? I look forward to your arguments in the discussion forum.